Okay, friends, a very good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on the country you're in. Very warm welcome to each and every one of you to this webinar on MLTF risks in correspondent banking, organized by Fintellect and the Asian Bankers Association. My name is Shirish Pathak. I head Fintellect, and I will be the moderator for the session today. At the outset, let me thank the ABA for their ongoing support to make these webinars tremendously popular and well attended. At today's webinar, we have over 600 participants registered from more than 35 countries. Today's webinar will be in an entirely interactive conversational format through which I will engage the panelists with various questions on the subject and solicit their views. Also, all of our speakers will be on live video throughout the session. So just in case you hear any background noises, children shouting, dogs barking, or other people, please do excuse us. This is all part of working from home. And at any point of time, if you drop out due to internet connectivity issues on your side and cannot log in again, don't worry, the webinar recording will be available for all of you tomorrow, and each of the participants will be receiving a link after the webinar is over. Also, please feel free to post questions at any time using the Q&A button, which is there on your screen, and we will take them up to the best extent possible during the last 15 minutes of the session today. Let me now introduce our panelists for the webinar. Going ladies first. So it's Dilani Suryachi, Head of Compliance, Ceylon Bank from Sri Lanka. Dilani, welcome to the webinar.
Hi, all.
Our second panelist is Teresa Karunakaran, Director Compliance of Regulatory Affairs at Deutsche Bank India, based in Mumbai. Teresa, welcome. And our third panelist is Saurabh Nagar, Director Business Solutions Group at APAC at Acuity Singapore. So welcome, Saurabh, to the webinar.
Thanks, Suresh.
So in today's session, we will broadly take up 4 or 5 key issues for discussion. Starting with, let's say, what are the inherent risks in correspondent banking from an AML CFT point of view, and their implementation and their implications on ongoing monitoring and on risk management. We'll also speak a bit about the Wolfsburg CBDDQ, which has been a topic of debate for the last couple of years, and now it's in its, I think, third revised version. We will also speak about the pressure from correspondent banks, which is forcing respondent banks to drive, to become more and more compliant. We will also speak a bit about de-risking, adopting a risk-based approach, and finally, what are the best practices for due diligence in this area. So to start off, maybe Saurabh, let me pose the first question to you. So coming to the inherent MLTF risks in correspondent banking, what do you think some of these risks are broadly, and what are the implications on ongoing monitoring and risk management within banks?
Thanks, Suresh, for the question. I think it's a good question to start with to set the premise. In my opinion, generally, the market view is that correspondent banking is high risk, and there are very valid and obvious reasons for this view. So when you're setting up a correspondent banking relationship as a bank, you are essentially putting trust in the correspondent bank's ability to know who their customers are, and that they have done their proper due diligence on their customers. They have proper controls, etc. Because your correspondent bank is essentially going to be moving money of their customers through the account that they hold with you. And you do not necessarily have a view or a detailed view on the underlying transaction. And therefore, it becomes very important for you as a bank to be very sure of the due diligence policies and controls of the correspondent banks. And this is the reason why it's seen as a high risk in general. So now that we have established that it's high risk, it makes sense for us to ensure that we are doing enhanced due diligence. So the basic level of due diligence therefore would not be sufficient for such a high risk relationship, because we've just established that it's high risk. And the basic level of due diligence would not allow you to truly understand what are the risks that are posed through this relationship if you were to engage with this correspondent bank in a certain country. and hence the need for going deeper and the whole enhanced due diligence piece. Now, the challenge becomes even paramount when you are now having to do it at a regular frequency. So, you mentioned ongoing monitoring of these relationships. So setting up a relationship has its own challenges because you have to do an enhanced due diligence. Now, to do it at a regular frequency, it becomes even greater challenge. Now, to broadly, when I speak around correspondent banking in various forums, there are fundamentally three questions that needs to be answered. So first question is, who is my customer? Second one is, should I do business with this customer? And the third one is, can I do business with this customer? Right now, on the surface, these three questions are very simple. But if you ask any banker, especially the FI department of a bank, they will tell you that to get answers or go through these questions, these three questions requires navigating various processes, various departments, and a lot of different data points that needs to be collected and analyzed in order to come to a conclusion. And typically, based on our surveys, the time taken, if you're lucky, to get through these three questions can be as low as 12 hours, but it can be on an upwards of 28 hours plus. So it is an immense effort to start with, and largely the time that is spent on question 2 and 3. Should I do business and can I do business, right? So should I do business is pretty simple in most cases. It's a black and white. It revolves around sanctions. So is this entity sanctioned, right? If it's sanctioned, I can't do business. If it's not sanctioned, then I have to dig deeper and find other risk areas if there are. Now, even with the question number 2, which revolves around sanctions, it's not just on the surface. You have to go deeper and look at the ownership structures. Are there nested relationship? Is this bank owned by a bank which perhaps exposes you to sanctions risk? So you can now imagine, through this conversation, how complicated this is and how many data points that needs to be collected. Now, the last question, can I do business, largely is around, around the risk-based approach that you might have as a bank. So you need to be able to do your own risk assessment, have a policy around it, and then take decisions. So the ultimate question that needs to be answered is, how do you know in your complex network of correspondent banks, that you do not have any exposure to sanctions, either directly or maybe 4 level down the line in the ownership structures? I hope I answered the question.
Sure. Thanks, Saurabh. Teresa, may I also request for your comments on this particular question, because you have experience of being a regulator for years and years, as well as then being in commercial bank. So, what would you say? Let's say the top 3 risks in correspondent banking from an AML CFT point of view, and its implications on banks.
Yeah, thanks, Shirish. The first and foremost thing is from the point of view of global GDP and the economic development of the nations, is essential for the less developed countries to have a correspondent banking relationship, which allows them access to different markets where they normally would not have access. In fact, the former chief of the IMF likened correspondent banking to the blood which carries nutrients to the various parts of the body. And that is something which, without a correspondent banking relationship, a country, say in the African country or a Caribbean nation, will find it very difficult to access markets, get sources of finance, foreign investment in the country, and this ultimately leads to the development. In fact, one of the studies had also indicated that the growth in the GDP is linked closely to how good and effective the correspondent banking relationships are. Where there's been cutback in relationship, it has struck very much at the development of the country, and GDP growth has come down a couple of notches below what it was required, and which has impact on the livelihood, the entire economy of the country. So that being said, it is not an altruistic proposition for banks to do business and with countries which pose high risk. And that is the biggest risk in correspondent banking, is that the banks which do business with the respondent bank in a country do not normally have a clear view on the customers. As Saurabh mentioned, we would know the bank. It would be very difficult to go down and see who are the customers. A deeper due diligence, of course, as we'll go and we'll see, would necessarily be required to see who exactly are the customers of the respondent bank, what is the kind of business they do, which territories, geographies they do business, what are the products they offer, who are their owners for both of the respondent bank and who are the beneficial owners for the customers there. So this has got ramifications when you see how money will move from the respondent bank to the correspondent bank and into the international financial system. And this has been a challenge for many countries. If you see in the Danske Bank, where money was flowing through a bank and from non-resident accounts, money largely from there were flowing without any question. There in the one MDB case also, money was flowing in without having a clear perception of who were the beneficial owners, who were the actual customers of the respondent banks who were having access to the international financial system through the correspondent bank. So that is the biggest challenge correspondent bank faces, knowing effectively the customer. And this to overcome this, essentially they should follow the same due diligence process that they follow as when they co-opt an ordinary customer of theirs. Do the due diligence on the customer, basis the records, etc. See what is the lines of business. And in the case of respondent banks, go beyond it to see who are the owners, who are the beneficial owners, are there PEPs involved in it, who are the customers of the respondent bank. Are there nested relationships coming there? Are they payable through accounts, which poses entirely new dimensions of risk into the entire relationship, and which, when they look at it from the point of view of onboarding a customer, they have to take a clear view whether they are prepared, whether they have enough information at their end, and also have the necessary controls in place to manage that risk. Once they are sure of that, only then with the senior management approval can they onboard a respondent bank as their customer. But yes, they cannot decline a relationship without having valid reasons or giving a respondent bank an opportunity to rise up to the controls or the standards expected of them.
Right. Thanks, Teresa. Teresa, let me also get your inputs on the Wolfsburg CBDDQ. So the revised version was released on April 17th. That was version 1.3, and it has enhanced its ease of use and readability. Now, having said that, the questionnaire itself has over the last couple of years subjected banks to a much higher level of due diligence. But what are the changes that you believe have taken place within the AML frameworks of banks after the implementation of this questionnaire? And at the same time, there was a statement from the Wolfsburg group which says, as early adopters of the CBDDQ, the member banks of the Wolfsburg group have been incorporating the questionnaire into their due diligence programs, and respondent banks should, if they have not done so already, be using the CBDDQ and may expect to find that this questionnaire will no longer be deemed sufficient by their correspondents. So Teresa, could you comment on this?
Yeah, the Wolfsburg questionnaire, CBDD questionnaire, is pretty exhaustive in the sense from around 60, it has come to around 110 questions. And if you see the entire questionnaire, it gives an entire perspective of a customer should be onboarding. In fact, the due diligence on the customer, the jurisdictions where they have business, looking at it from a legal entity perspective as part of a group. Who are the members of the group who are, who are associated with the respondent bank, and it also goes into the policies in place, the AML, CFT policies in place, including the corruption, anti-corruption policies in place. And also there is a dimension towards the non-resident customers which they have. What is the extent of non-resident customers they are having? What is the level of extent of business, etc. So uh, that and the governance requirements posed by the CBDT questionnaire is something which I find is as stringent as a normal customer onboarding in a bank. So in that sense, like most of the banks today are largely compliant with, or rather are cognizant of FATF requirements. Each country has adopted an AML, KYC, CFT process. It is embedded in their policies, regulations, and statutes, and so many of these things already form part of their policies. But of course, there is a lot of granularity in the Wolfsburg questionnaire, which may be respondent banks in countries which may not have the same rigor of AML safety would find it difficult. And that is where the expectation would be from a correspondent bank who's entering into a relationship with such a bank, that they try to overcome this or try to build in more rigor into their process, so that whatever concerns arise due to gaps in information are met and bridged.
Right. All right, Dilani, let me bring you in now, and let's speak a bit about the pressure from correspondent banks driving more stringent AML compliance amongst the respondent banks, especially those based in weaker AML regimes. So, do you think the threat of de-risking, is that a very important factor on the regulatory agenda, as well as also within the reporting entities in your jurisdiction? And secondly, I have a part B to that question, which maybe Teresa can take later. What do you see banks around the region, especially those which are on the cusp of the grey list? They may not actually be in the grey list, but there's a fear that they may get in. How are they managing the risk? So maybe Dilani, if you can take part A of the question, and Teresa, maybe you can after that take part B. That would be great.
Is of course de-risking is a serious concern of the regulator, because de-risking is a phenomenon by which the financial institutions terminate or rather curtail the relationships with certain customers or certain categories of the customers. So for correspondence banks, they have certain reasons to take this decision. They look at the profitability, they look at the reputational risk of that institution, they look at the lower risk appetite of the respondent bank and the regulatory burden on them on AML CFT compliance. And also we have seen in the recent past a rise in the fines and the criminal prosecution against the financial institutions by the regulatory bodies, which also may have paved the way for these de-risking decisions. So this de-risking, as Teresa also clearly explained, it has negative consequences on the financial institutions as well as the economies of the country. So because of this, actually, as we all know, international bodies, including FATF, Basel Committee on Bank Supervision, have been developing mechanisms, robust mechanisms to ensure transparency of the international transactions. As we all are aware, in 2016, FATF, basically focusing at this de-risking aspect, they issued these guidelines on correspondent banking, because de-risking, on the other hand, has certain negative impacts, because this may drive the financial institutions to less regulated channels, and also they will reduce the transactions transparency and also financial exclusion. So actually, yes, it is a serious concern to the regulator from both these angles, because on one hand it affects the economy, financial institutions and the economy, and the other hand all these the declines and decrease in the status of transparency. So we strongly felt it's a serious concern to the regulator. As a member of Sri Lanka, the citizen of Sri Lanka, I have experienced this, because the Sri Lanka have been grey listed by FATF in 2017, followed by blacklisting by the EU. So the regulator took it very serious. So there have been a lot of efforts, tremendous efforts by the regulator to overcome this situation, because we felt the fear of de-risking subsequent to this grey listing. So there have been a lot of efforts to improve the supervision by the regulator, to improve the international cooperation, and to improve the legal, to strengthen the legal framework, so on and so forth. Actually, the regulator enhance the risk-based supervision and outreach to financial institutions to a great extent, and the regulator also established the TFS regime to enhance the implementation of UNCR SCRS, so which are good proof for Sri Lankan regulator to take this as a serious concern.
Right. Thanks, Ilani. Teresa, what are your thoughts on the pressure from correspondent banks driving compliance amongst the respondents, the de-risking part, and also what should banks be doing to manage this risk, especially those who are on the cusp of getting to the grey list?
Can you please repeat? You are not very clear.
Oh, sorry. Okay, can you hear me now, Teresa?
Yeah.
Okay, so Teresa, often the pressure from correspondent banks is able to drive more stringent AML compliance amongst the respondent banks, especially those who are in weaker AML regimes, right? So what I asked Dilani was, does the threat of de-risking feature as an important feature on the regulatory agenda in their jurisdiction? So I would like to get your thoughts on this. And also, secondly, I'd like to get your thoughts on what do you think banks around the region, those who are on the cusp of the grey list, right, those nations, what should they be doing to manage this risk?
Yeah, from the regulatory point of view, regulators have
Teresa, I can't hear you. I think you need to. Unmute.
Can you hear me?
It's fine now.
So regulators across the world, in fact, are very conscious, or rather very, and they advise extra caution where banks are entering into cross-border transactions. And as such, there are regulations in place where in fact, the FATF has also come out. FATF has guidelines on correspondent banking, where they have asked the banks to do due diligence on their correspondent banking customers, what kind of due diligence to be done. In fact, even do the assessment of the regions in which they are working, their products, business, etc., which they are offering. And regulators are very have also laid down like what is the kind of due diligence you have to do in correspondent banking relationships, and also monitor cross-border transactions above a certain cutoff. Every jurisdiction has prescribed where there has to be due diligence, and where there has to be some mechanism also to reach out to the respondent to bank, or the beneficiary in the bank which is receiving it, to see if there is a kind of suspicion on the nature of the transaction. It should be possible for the correspondent bank to reach out to the respondent bank and get the information on a suspicious transaction. There are, of course, certain concerns coming up here because of secrecy laws which are across in certain jurisdictions, and banks necessarily have to have that, or regulators have to have that agreement to share information. And in the correspondent banking relationships also, there should be agreements built in, so that this kind of information is, say, on the nature of credit goes to a beneficiary, and the correspondent bank has suspicions that this could be a suspicious transaction, not necessarily related to his line of business. It could be indicative of some kind of trafficking or other kinds of illegal activity. And for that, it needs to be able to reach out to the respondent bank, get the information from them at the right within a certain quickly in time frame, so that these transactions are nipped, and you are able to also raise suspicious transactions on this, and also have a close watch on the customers. The concern which banks and regulators have on the correspondent banking activity is that it could be a channel for moving funds from illegal funds across, through respondent banks which have lesser controls into jurisdictions or other banks where the controls may be not strong enough, and they rely basically on the correspondent bank's reputation to process the transaction. That being said, even in the present scenario, where you have a lot of countries receiving funds from COVID for COVID welfare and stuff like that, prevention of that, or for relief from that, funds are flowing in from international agencies. There is a possibility that in such a scenario also, that currently there could be a flow of funds to beneficiaries other than legitimate ones. And these are some of the concerns which regulators and correspondent banks should be aware of, and take necessary actions to monitor the transactions to see that this are in line with the customer profile, and they are able to link it and able to establish the integrity of these transactions. So in a way, this is an area which is always of concern to the regulator. That being said, no regulator would unilaterally like any correspondent bank to seize a relationship merely because it is high risk. Regulators are always open in various jurisdictions to offer support, like if there is a suspicion that a respondent bank may not be complying with all the regulations, or even at the initial stage before onboarding a respondent bank, the regulator in that particular country is willing to give information, and also in their assessment they can provide the necessary controls. I mean, the kind of rigors they have put into their own AML regulations to ensure that business is conducted in a safe manner in their particular country.
Right. Thanks, Teresa. Teresa, while I have you online, can you speak a bit more about adopting the risk-based approach? What do you think banks should do to adopt that risk-based approach, especially the correspondent banks, to make sure that the global trade and business is not ultimately affected? I know you mentioned a bit of it in what you said right now, but if you can stress on adopting the risk-based approach.
Yeah, basically the bank should be adopting a risk-based approach while entering into any relationship, because ultimately the challenge and the constraint in entering into certain correspondent banking relationships is the high cost of doing business, the high cost of doing the due diligence. While you have various agencies, or where you can do a KYC, you can get information on the customer, the respondent bank. There is always a challenge, like when you have to do the due diligence, it becomes a costly affair. You have to the cost of onboarding the customer, doing a deep dive into the customer's business, then a close monitoring of the business to ensure that it is that is in line with the customer's profile. This is a very costly affair. So that is one of the things which deter, or rather which correspondent banks would kind of deter them from doing business with the respondent banks. And to overcome this is the risk-based approach. And in that perspective, correspondent banks should be looking at, rather than going maybe the whole hog, like the Wurzburg questionnaire, for instance, is very exhaustive. It also says that the correspondent bank can look at other parameters also if it feels is necessary to do a due diligence on the customer. But then, to be rational, to adopt a risk-based approach, the correspondent bank should look at, say, for instance, the geography in which the bank is operating, the type of customers it has. If it's mostly like customers which pose low risk, who are maybe, say, MSME customers who are generally exporting their goods, and or buying something, importing something from another country. These are kind of customers with low risk. So look at it from the risk-based parameter of the customers of that respondent bank, the type of business they do, apply the level of controls and the monitoring which you would do to a customer of that level if he is your customer in your own jurisdiction. And also in the COVID scenario is there there's a lot of support which so adding the burden of controls and asking, and ultimately what I feel is that it should not boil down to a paper gathering exercise, getting a lot of information, putting it away, and just as an evidence to the regulator, oh, we have done all this, and so we are good. That's not actually what a correspondent bank should do. It should look at a respondent bank, its customer profile. If say it's in Bangladesh or in a country where the level of the type of customers of that bank, as I mentioned, MSME customers who would require some support to do their export business, to carry on that business, they would be receiving funds, borrowing funds to even do their exports. So that kind of thing would require more support from the correspondent bank, looking at it in a holistic manner rather than bringing it down to a purely paper gathering exercise to fulfill the questionnaire requirements, and making a risk-based approach to see what exactly would be, and closely monitoring. One of the best practices is to monitor the transactions of the customer newly onboarded, say, respondent bank for say 6 to 12 months. And if there are concerns coming up during the course of that transaction, then you apply a greater level of due diligence.
Right, right. So Teresa, we'll get into the best practices a bit later. Let me also, for this question, maybe ask Saurabh to share some of his thoughts, on that whole responsibilities of banks on both sides of the relationship. How can correspondent banks continue to adopt the risk-based approach so that global trade and business are, not adversely affected? Saurabh, if I can get your view on that as well.
Thanks, Suresh. So I agree with my co-panelist Teresa on what she had mentioned on how regulators are open to looking at case-by-case basis, and just because you are in a weaker or in a jurisdiction with AML deficiencies, it does not mean that you should do a blanket de-risking. So I would say that the responsibilities are because banking world, financial institutions are part of a community. So it's a shared responsibility that both sides have, right? It's only when we start looking at it from a shared responsibility perspective is when we'll be able to fight financial crimes together. If we keep on saying that your responsibility is to up your game and my responsibility is just to check you, I don't think that's how we're going to be able to fight financial crime together. So the idea is that we are part of a community, and there's a shared responsibility on both sides, and it should start with having a core principle that we are here in this together to fight financial crime, right? So that's the core message. But you're correct in stating that there are limitations in strengthening the AML framework, especially in the weaker countries. So you're right. So there has to be a balance in creating economic opportunities and also mitigate, if not eliminate altogether, financial crime. But the whole idea is that nobody likes de-risking, and my co-panelists have shared some light on it. De-risking is against trade, especially in APAC, where most countries are trade-based economies. We have seen development over the year through extensive trade. De-risking, either blanket de-risking of the whole jurisdiction or certain sector, is detrimental to this growth, and it leads to adoption of non-regulated channels of fund transfer. Right? If a certain jurisdiction is de-risked, take an extreme case that a complete jurisdiction is de-risked, I would still want to do business, and for doing business, I will have to move money. So, and I can't get access to financial services, so I'll go to unregulated channels. Now that defeats the whole purpose of regulations in the first place. So, and that's why risk-based approach is suggested by the different watchdogs, FATF, as well as the regulators. Now, coming back to how some of the banks, the correspondent banks can continue to adopt risk-based approach. I think first thing is start with this core principle that we don't want de-risking. We are here to reduce financial crime and at the same time increase financial inclusion. That's the whole idea of this community. And then instead of taking a blanket view on a certain jurisdiction, a certain sector, look at case-by-case basis, right? Try to understand the business that the relationship that you're trying to enter. Do a proper risk assessment. Follow Wurzburg questionnaire, but as Teresa mentioned, you can have your own parameters depending on the jurisdiction that you're trying to set up this relationship in. It's 2020, so why don't you use technology to reduce certain manual efforts and focus on the aspects which still cannot, take advantage of technology. Try to get access to trusted sources which can give you information that you're trying to collect. Use technology, use the latest tools available. Some of these data points are available through APIs, which can seamlessly integrate in your workflows. So that's one of the ways that correspondent banks have been adopting risk-based approach, and should be looking forward in adopting trade-based approach, because again, it boils down to the fundamental principle that we are here, to prevent financial crime and increase financial inclusion as a bottom line.
Right. Thanks, Saurabh. So we are now about 37 minutes into the webinar. My recommendation would be to, let's say, spend the next 8 or 9 minutes in getting inputs from each of you on what are the best practices, or what is the advice that you have for all the people listening in. And after that, we will move into the Q&A session with the audience. So let me first start with Saurabh, and then followed by Dilani, and then by Teresa. So Saurabh, can you share any best practices for due diligence, right, that can help mitigate some of the AML safety risks that arise from correspondent banking? Right.
So there are three areas or three pillars, as I like to call it, that I always suggest for due diligence as a whole. It also applies to correspondent banking, but this principle can be applied to your trade compliance or your customer due diligence as well. So it always starts with people. Having trained key personnel in your institution, and ensuring that they are constantly being trained, because this is a dynamic world, right? Things are changing, new typologies of risk are being identified, and people need to be trained constantly on this. So start by investing in people, have trained personnel available to you, and then do your own risk assessment. There are frameworks available suggested by FATF themselves. Do your risk assessment, and you can start by assessing the risk of the country or a particular sector in that country. How much of a risk that does it expose you to? Do a name screening on the institution that you're trying to enter a relationship with. Check their beneficial owners, right? Check for nested relationships. As I've mentioned in the first question, is this entity owned by another entity which may expose you to sanctions risk? So do all this risk assessment, and then through that, this should formulate controls, right? These risk assessments should be part of the processes and controls that you will formulate. So you have people, and then you have processes which should be independent of functions, right? So they should not be overshadowed by business. So if business takes precedence than compliance, then business always wins. So again, the principle that compliance should be an independent function is always there. Last but not the least, depending on the kind of business you are into, you make use of technologies. There are various technologies available now, and which can allow you to reduce a lot of manual work, a lot of laborious manual work that is prone to human errors, as well as it's time consuming. So as I mentioned, a lot of these activities take an upward of 28 plus hours, and that translates to cost, and that actually deters a lot of these institutions in getting into the high risk jurisdiction and leading to de-risking as a result. So invest in technology that is right for you. So that's the three things at a broad level that I would say are the best practices: so people, processes, and technology.
Thanks, Saurabh. So Dilani, coming to you, I'd like to get your thoughts on best practices for due diligence, not just in your bank, but also because you are the head of the Association of Compliance Officers of Banks in Sri Lanka. At a collective level, what do you see banks doing in terms of best practices?
I totally agree with Saurabh. He talks about key best practices in terms of technology, in terms of human skills and processes. So if I talk about the ACOB level, the compliance officers level, we also strongly believe in developing human infrastructure, because it's more than the systems and processes. It's a human who handles all these things, so that the staff handling these handling AML and CFT has to be knowledgeable enough, knowledgeable enough and skillful enough to handle the issues. So we heavily invest in developing the human, enhancing the knowledge and enhancing the soft skills of the staff, which is a key focus of the Compliance Officers Association of Sri Lanka. And the same thing is applied in my bank as well. And also we very much focus in culture, developing the culture and good governance, not only within the organization and also among the industry, because we all have to play same in the field. There have to be level playing. So we focus on that as well as a best practice.
Right. Thanks, Dilani. Teresa, do you agree with Saurabh and Dilani, or is there anything incremental that you feel banks should be doing?
Yeah, I think they have pretty much covered all the best practices. Just maybe one or two things which I could add to that is that while you are looking at the respondent bank, it will be very important to see what are the members in the group of the respondent bank, what are the kind of relationship they have, and as a corollary to that, who are the owners of the respondent bank, who are on the group structures also, name screening. And what is also important is in the risk-based approach, build in whatever you have, information you have collected from your questionnaires into the AML CFT monitoring, the risk profile of the customer, have a strategic profile of the respondent bank, which you can, based on, say, changes in the scenario, regulatory action taken against a bank, maybe some kind of bad press reports coming in, like some AML concerns is caught in some kind of money laundering scam or some negative news coming. Those kind of things should be factored into the strategic profile so that you have a holistic risk assessment. And as Saurabh suggested, it's very important to invest in the appropriate technology which is necessary for you. And this is applicable both. The correspondent bank generally has in place the latest in technology, and has the money also to invest in resources. This may not be true of a respondent bank, which would necessarily maybe some handholding, as again Saurabh mentioned, that this is a relationship. It's like two hands getting together to form a relationship, a successful relationship, which is necessary from the country's point of view and from both points of view, for the respondent bank and for the correspondent bank. And to continue that relationship effectively, they have to invest in resources. From the point of view of the respondent bank, it is to have a dialogue with the correspondent bank to see if they find that there are concerns, how best they can address that, how they can bring up their governance level, their policies, their processes in place to match that of the correspondent bank expectations. And to that extent, it will be helpful to both the countries, because there is always a danger if you make the process very stringent, that people will opt for other ways, hawala transactions. Money will go it's like what you say, when it rains, if there are cracks on the floor, the water drains into the wherever the easier way to go in. So that should not happen where financial wealth flows happen in a country. And to effectively to seek or prevention of financial crime, and money laundering. It has to be necessary that the controls built in are pragmatic. They are reasonable and in proportion to the risk posed by the respondent bank in a particular jurisdiction, and the correspondent bank is able to manage those risks effectively, and when necessary it can bring the correspondent bank to kind of come up to his expectations while doing some hand holding, tell them what is wrong, where they need to improve. And I think that way their successful relationship can be built up, which is essential in the global context, particularly when so much countries today depend so much on each other for their development.
Right. Thanks, Teresa. So let's go to the Q&A session now. We've got quite a few questions received from our audience. Let me start with, let's say, one for Saurabh. This one is from Cambodia, Saurabh. It's from Utira Sofat. And the question is, do we have to perform screening on both the sender, who is from the correspondent bank, and the receiver at our bank? So it's more like a yes or no sort of question.
Yeah, I would like to expand on this instead of just saying yes or no.
Sure.
I think it starts with understanding your own processes, right? So the core principle is, do you understand both sides, right? Do you have enough understanding of is there a risk that a sender pose on you, and the receiver assumingly is your customer. If it's your customer, then do you have enough confidence that you are monitoring and doing due diligence on an ongoing basis on your customer? If you are confident that you know your customer and you're very confident on your account due diligence process, then yes, you focus more on the receiver part, because that is an unknown. But however, what I have seen with my experience in Asia Pacific is generally the consensus is that we want to check both involved in a transaction. And this could be because of various reasons, but as a principle, if you adopt these three questions that I mentioned, do you know who both sides of the spectrum are? If you do not, then yes, you have to perform. It's as simple as that. If you know your customer very well and you're confident, then just focus on the receiver.
Sure, thanks, Saurabh. Teresa, maybe you can take this next question. This is from Binita Jain. There are relations with banks or remittance business groups for whom we are not doing any correspondent banking, but just maintaining an account as a parking account. In that case, do we need to get involved for enhanced due diligence for them also? That is requirement of CBDDQ and review. Is that applicable in these cases or not? So for parking accounts.
So as long as a bank or is a customer of yours, I'm not able to see that particular question, but what I would say that there is a due diligence process, irrespective of whether you're doing a correspondent banking relationship with a particular bank or he's just a customer. Because any bank which is opening an account with you, there is some kind of due diligence involved there, just like any other customer happens. The relatively higher level of due diligence happens when there's a correspondent banking relationship. So I would say that there should be a fair level of customer onboarding process as you would do for a normal customer.
Right. Okay, we have one more. Oh gosh, where is that? Yeah, we have one more question from Sindhuja Arumugam, who asks, can you please share if transaction monitoring needs to be done differently for correspondent banking accounts as compared with retail or corporate customer transactions? So maybe Saurabh or Lani, if you want to take this one. It's on transaction monitoring.
Delani, you want to take this?
The question is not that clear to me, actually.
Okay, Saurabh, do you want to take it?
Yes, yeah. So I mean, I can take it from and based on my experience, I think that the idea is that there are different patterns that you're looking at, and obviously it depends on what sort of services you are providing to your customer, and through this correspondent banking relationship, what services are being, you're offering. So based on that, you would have different patterns, that you would have to monitor. And a simple answer is yes, because there are different patterns arising from the different level of services that you might be offering to these two different set of customers. Then yes, it will be different transaction monitoring logic that you will apply there. So it all boils down to understanding what sort of services you're offering, and if it poses a different risk pattern, then it'll be different transaction monitoring logic that you will apply.
Thanks, Saurabh. Okay, we have one more question from May Mariano, who says, what is the extent of AML CFT responsibility or accountability of the correspondent bank when involved in MLTF incidents? Example, it's used as a channel to remit funds. Teresa, would you like to take that one?
Yeah. The correspondent bank would be responsible because the transactions flow through it to the across border transactions. So if it has not done the due diligence on the respondent bank, seen or his level of controls have not picked up that these transactions are not in line with the customer profile, and they have not been able to kind of stop or raise an alert on those suspicious transaction alert on that, it would be the responsibility of the correspondent bank in such a transaction. And that having been said, it doesn't mean that the respondent bank is totally absolved of the responsibility, because the respondent bank is expected to know its customer more closely than the correspondent bank. And the fact that it is putting through these transactions, facilitating these transactions to a correspondent bank, would also put an onus equally on the respondent bank in their country, or from the point of view of any transgression of the AML CFT regulations.
Thanks. Okay, we have another question. This is from Anita Upadhyay from Nepal. She asks, can you explain how a respondent bank assesses the MLTF risk associated with the correspondent bank? So this is really the other way around. So Dilani, you may have had some experience in this, so maybe you could take that, followed by maybe Teresa.
Yeah, actually, respondent bank evaluating the correspondent bank who provides the correspondent banking services. In this case, correspondent bank, who is a service provider, is at a stronger position than the respondent bank. For example, if a small bank, a local bank, obtaining the services of a strong foreign international bank, evaluating the risk of that bank is actually a challenge. Sending the questionnaires and getting the responses from the stronger bank has been a challenge for many of the local small banks. There are instances where the bigger banks have asked the local smaller banks to get the information from their websites and all that. Actually, evaluating the risk of a correspondent bank who is the service provider is a challenge actually to a small respondent bank, in my experience.
Thanks. Teresa, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, as she said, the correspondent bank is the big brother in the relationship. So the respondent bank is actually looking at it as a service provider. So from the point of view of the respondent bank, it would be mainly, does this correspondent bank help me to meet my requirements? That is, will it help my customer to have access to other markets? Will it be at a reasonable cost? The cost factors would be looking at the ease of doing transactions. All this would be the perspective from which a respondent bank looks at a correspondent bank, rather than from the AML CFT controls. But having said that, if the correspondent bank has been in the news for some negative reasons, then if the respondent bank is looking for a relationship with it, maybe it will do a double think before entering into a relationship with a correspondent bank for having access to a market in a different jurisdiction, a financial system in a different jurisdiction, because it would reflect on its own reputation. There would be a reputational risk for the respondent bank. But generally, the respondent bank would look at the ease of doing business and the access it provides to a financial system, and how cost effective it is.
Right. Thanks, Teresa. Okay, we have one question. If someone has to get into the correspondent banking domain and continue to enhance the skill sets, what courses do you recommend? So let me plug in something for Fintellect here and saying that you should consider the virtual classrooms organized by Fintellect, and you can see it on fintellect.com. Coming to one more question. Okay, how do correspondent banks, how are correspondent banks able to obtain adequate information on customers of partner correspondent banks if the jurisdiction where the partner bank is operating has limitations on deposit secrecy or sharing of depositor/account information? Who would like to take that?
It's a challenge as a respondent bank providing certain information requested by this correspondent bank to do their KYCC has been a challenge in to a certain extent due to the secrecy laws of the country, because there have been instances where the details of accounts, account holders, the number of accounts and the jurisdictions, details of Vostro accounts, Nostro accounts and all that, which the local bank prevents from sharing with the correspondent bank due to the secrecy laws of the country. So that's actually is a real challenge. In that case, the respondent bank, I think, have to nicely explain the reason to the correspondent bank and tackle the case. Other than that, the respondent bank is not in a position to release that information because that will be a breach of the local regulations.
If I may add to what Dilani has said, some of these things would be incorporated in the agreements between the correspondent bank and the respondent bank on to what extent information can be shared. Because this is, and even the correspondent, say, is a partner bank in another jurisdiction. Like, what is the kind of information requirements they have, to what extent they can be shared when asked for? Because this is an essential part of the doing business, and if the correspondent bank has to get some information on a client and or has a suspicion on some of the transactions going through it, it necessarily has to get that. And some of those things, even the present guidelines which are coming out in cross-border transactions in India, require any message which is sent across, the funds transfer message when it's delivered to the beneficiary bank, to also get the details of the beneficiary at the other end. So to some extent, to capture those details, which is part of the kind of international norms in transactions, this would be one which would be part of the normal international norms in the banking transaction. The other would have to be governed by the agreements in place between the banks, so that they know to what extent they can get the information, and that would help them in building the controls around it, in seeing how effectively and how quickly can they get information when they require it.
Thanks, Reza. Saurabh, maybe you can take the next question. It's from Ibadullah Siddiq, who asks, is there any established rating framework or mechanism available in the market for the correspondent bank that can help select the most available compliant correspondent bank?
Interesting question. So I wish there was. However, there are different sort of ratings available. So you have the corruption index, right? So that can be your first step. So if you are getting into a relationship with a correspondent bank which is in a country where the corruption index is the ranking is pretty low, that is one parameter that you will look at. So if you have such ratings available, so essentially what we are looking at is, from a framework perspective, is establishing if this particular entity that you're trying to get into relationship with is actually a bank, right? There have been instances, and these are instances shared by my discussions with some customers. Just because you have a SWIFT code does not mean you're a bank, right? Anybody can actually apply for a SWIFT code. You need to check if there is a proper banking license that the bank has. So you need to have that license made available to you, and there are ways to get it through either asking the bank, or there are tools available. It's publicly available information. So establishing that you have the banking, the entity has the banking license, the first step. Then you're looking at their policies, right? Their AML TF policies that can either be shared through the due diligence questionnaire that we were talking about in the earlier questions, or shared through unilateral arrangements. So that will give you an insight of what is an extent of policy and controls that this bank has. These questions, especially in Bool's question, there are questions which go deeper to an extent of asking how automated your KYC process is. And it's not just a checkbox, you are asking for evidences as well. So that's part of the framework as well. So I would say there is no list of banks which are compliant, and you can quickly look through it and get your job done. I think if it was that easy, we wouldn't be talking here on this topic. Unfortunately, it's not. There are efforts that the community is making to through the use of blockchain. They're looking at various ways of getting this information available to in a consistent manner to everybody. But at this moment, there is no list. But as I said, there are different ratings that you can look at. There's this corruption index that you can look at. There are jurisdictions which are weaker in their AML framework. That list is produced by Global Watchdogs. That is something that you can look at to formulate your views.
Right. Thanks, Saurabh. So I think we are out of time. We are, I think, about 2 minutes over time. So let me thank each of our panelists, Dilani, Teresa, and Saurabh, for being here with us today. Also, a big thank you to our partner, Asian Bankers Association, especially Ernest, Amador, and Reed, for working together with Fintellect for this webinar, and so many others that we've done in the past and which we'll do in the future. Finally, let me also announce that the Fintellect Asia AML CFT second annual summit is happening virtually over 5 days from July 20th to 24th. And I would urge each one of you to register for it if you haven't done so already. We have more than 25 global speakers over these 5 days, and the summit is entirely free to attend. So do take advantage of this learning opportunity. With that, let me close today's webinar. Have a great day ahead, and look forward to seeing you at the next one. Bye.
Yeah, good day. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.